The Church of the Nativity, Bethlehem. In a crypt below is the shrine that marks where Christian pilgrims believe Jesus Christ was born to the Virgin Mary.
The classic religious image of Christmas is that picture of the stable with the baby Jesus in a manger.
Now experts are investigating where this vision of Christmas comes from. By re-examining the Bible Gospels and through historical and archaeological analysis, we strip away 2,000 years of storytelling and separate the facts from fiction. As we open the mystery files on the birth of Christ. First century Judea. Joseph is traveling with his pregnant wife Mary from Nazareth to Bethlehem. The Romans have ordered them to take part in a census. They take shelter in the stable of a crowded inn. Jesus is born and laid in a manger, watched over by an ox and the faithful ass. As angels hover above, shepherds arrive to worship, as do three kings bearing gifts. It's the traditional Christmas story. The New Testament contains four main accounts of Jesus' life: the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Dr. Helen Bond is a New Testament scholar at the University of Edinburgh.
The story of the birth of Jesus is only in two Gospels. It's the first two chapters of both Matthew's Gospel and Luke's Gospel.
The established view is that Luke is a traveling companion of St. Paul and possibly a doctor of medicine.
Luke is probably writing for a non-Jewish readership. Part of what he's wanting to do in his gospel is to show how Christianity spread from its roots in Judaism and how it moved out into the non-Jewish or the Gentile world.
Matthew's account is widely held to have been written for early Jewish believers in the divinity of Jesus.
Traditionally, he's been said to have been one of Jesus' disciples and linked to Matthew the tax collector.
The Gospels of Matthew and Luke form the basis of the familiar nativity scene. But they agree on few of the details.
Matthew and Luke agree that Jesus' mother was Mary, his father was Joseph, also that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and that there was something unusual about his birth, specifically that his mother was a virgin when she conceived Jesus.
There are shepherds in Luke and not in Matthew. And there is no mention of the three kings in either Matthew or Luke. Giza Vermesh is Emeritus Professor of Jewish Studies at Oxford.
In the Gospel of Matthew, we have simply the mention of wise men or magicians or astrologers coming from the east, following a star, to greet the newborn king.
In the conventional nativity story, the astrologers become kings. The Gospels don't mention how many there were. Historians think the idea that there are three magi is derived from the individual gifts they bring: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The animals in the tableau are also not featured in the Gospels themselves. They probably come from an Old Testament prophecy about the coming of the Messiah.
The traditional picture of the stable with an ox and an ass and the baby, it comes in fact from the book of Isaiah, where the prophet says that the ox and the ass know their owner, but the Jews don't know me, God says.
Another key part of the Christmas narrative, the journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem, is found only in one gospel.
Luke talks about a census that was ordered by Augustus and was taken by the legate of Syria, who was called Quirinius. And we know that this census was a historical thing and was taken at the time when Judea became a Roman province.
Luke describes how the census requires the highly unusual and unlikely custom of returning to the place of your ancestors' birth.
We have all this census brought in to explain why Joseph and his heavily pregnant wife had to undertake this cumbersome journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem.
According to Luke's Gospel, Joseph is of the family of King David, so he must return to the town of David, Bethlehem. Matthew does not cite any journey, but agrees that Jesus is born in Bethlehem. It's in Luke that the familiar story of arriving in Bethlehem, where there is no room at the inn, is found. But Luke makes no mention of the stable portrayed in most nativity tableaux. Archaeologist Shimon Gibson is an expert on the Holy Land of the 1st century CE. He believes that this 2nd century BCE village near Jerusalem holds clues that the references to the inn have been mistranslated.
In the 1st century, visitors to a given village or small town would be put up in a house which was set aside for visitors who weren't staying in houses of people within the village or town, relatives and so forth. So in this case, on the arrival of Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem, they were invited to stay in one of the houses within the village.
The Greek word Luke uses, kataluma, can be translated as guest chamber, not inn in the sense of a paid lodging. Luke writes that Mary wraps baby Jesus in swaddling clothes and lays him in a manger. But Professor Gibson thinks the manger in Luke is also misinterpreted.
This is a typical ground floor of a house from the 1st or 2nd centuries BC in a village on the outskirts of Jerusalem. These kind of sort of ground floor parts of a house were typical of all periods, including the time of Jesus. And it's here that the animals were kept. A manger wasn't a trough filled with hay. A manger is actually a room which includes troughs for animals. This was the warmest room within the house. And so if you had a guest, you wouldn't take them to the upper rooms, the private parts of the house, but you would offer them to stay within the manger. Jesus was probably born in a chamber similar to this.
So animals may have been present at the birth of Jesus after all.
Usually we're talking about beasts of burden, such as donkeys and sometimes horses. And you would have chickens that were also kept in little chicken coops within the structure itself. Sheep and goats were always kept outside in animal pens.
Archaeology puts the donkey back in the picture. Another recurring feature in religious images of the Nativity is that of angels hovering over the scene.
Only Luke actually has angels in his account, and the angels come and appear to the shepherds, and it's through an angelic message that they find out about Jesus. There's no indication that they follow the shepherds to the manger, though clearly that again is part of that tableau that people have in their minds.
Luke's shepherds play a big part in the traditional Christmas story. But Professor Giza Vermesh believes that the references to shepherds could rule out a December date for the birth of Jesus.
Shepherds, even in Bethlehem, did not keep their sheep in the fields at night in winter, but in various shelters.
In fact, some early Christians celebrated the birth on either the 21st of April or the 20th of May. It's only later that the date is moved to December the 25th.
The date for the birth of Jesus is a Christian institution dating to the 4th century. December the 25th was chosen because in the Roman world it was a feast, the feast of the unvanquished sun.
One festival of light is simply transformed into another. The celebration of the birth of Christ. To Christians, the light of the world. But if the month of Jesus' birth is debatable, so is the year. Today, alongside BC and AD, we use BCE, or Before Common Era, and CE, Common Era, for the numbering of our years. It's a system that gives Jesus' birth year between 1 BCE and 1 CE, but it is a matter of much debate.
Luke mentions a census taken in 6 CE because that was the year that Judea became a Roman province, and Luke specifically links Jesus' birth to this. Luke also says that Jesus was born in the days of Herod the King, which some people have thought means Herod the Great, and the difficulty with that is that Herod died in 4 BCE.
If Luke is referring to Herod the Great and not his son, Herod Archelaus, then his narrative further clouds matters, as experts believe a Roman census would not have been ordered while Herod the Great was in power.
King Herod was a so-called client king of Rome, and client or friendly kings were not subjected by the Romans to a census.
With the Gospels apparently so full of contradictions, what is the evidence that a historical Jesus was even born at all? Flavius Josephus was a Jewish historian living in the 1st century CE. He makes a clear reference to Jesus in his chronicles.
Flavius Josephus was near contemporary of Jesus. He describes Jesus as a wise man and the performer of extraordinary deeds, which is about the simplest description of Jesus as a teacher and as a, quote, miracle worker.
There is another event in Luke's Gospel from which it's possible to deduce a year for Jesus' birth.
There is that statement in the Gospel of Luke that when Jesus appeared in public, he was about 30 years old. Now, Jesus appeared in public very shortly after the start of the public activity of John the Baptist.
According to Luke, John the Baptist surfaces in the 15th year of the Roman Emperor Tiberius, the year 29 CE. So, if Jesus is 30 in 29 CE, this suggests the year 1 BCE as a possible birth date. Jesus would need to be at least 3 years older to have lived in the time of Herod the Great, or 7 years younger to be subjected to the Roman census. Therefore, at least a decade's discrepancy is evident within Luke's conflicting versions of events. Whatever the year of Jesus' birth, that Matthew and Luke place it in Bethlehem fulfills another Old Testament prophecy, this time found in the book of Micah. But thou, Bethlehem Ephratah, which art little to be among the thousands of Judah, out of thee shall come one forth unto me, that is to be ruler in Israel. But it is in Nazareth, near Lake Galilee, that both Matthew and Luke say Jesus spent most of his life.
He's known in the New Testament as Jesus of Nazareth. And so they had to get over this problem that Jesus has to be born in Bethlehem, but then he grows up in Nazareth. And the way that they do it is quite different in each gospel.
Matthew writes how the Holy Family flee to Egypt to escape Herod's purge of newborn Jewish boys, conducted to eliminate the infant Jesus, seen by the king as a future threat to his throne. On Herod's death, the family moved to Nazareth. Luke states that Mary and Joseph live in Nazareth even before Jesus is born.
Both Matthew and Luke talk about Mary's virginal conception of Jesus, but the way that they describe it is rather different. Luke has Gabriel appearing to Mary, and the story is really taken from Mary's point of view. As far as Matthew is concerned, we only hear that Mary is suddenly found to be with child, and then the focus is on Joseph's reaction. He's outraged by this, and he's wondering about whether he should put Mary away silently, but then of course he has the dream that tells him that he should stay with Mary and raise the boy as his own.
Both Matthew and Luke are fulfilling another prophecy of Isaiah. Behold, a virgin shall conceive. Mary's lifelong virginity has also led to Joseph being portrayed as elderly in many nativity traditions.
The idea that Joseph was an old man with a young woman tries to explain why Mary remained a virgin after the birth of Jesus.
Whatever age Joseph is, he is always present at Mary's side at the scene of the birth. But the reality would have been quite different.
Birth in a first century Jewish family would be that only female members of the family are present together with a midwife.
In first century Judaism, many matters of the body were considered spiritually soiled, and this uncleanliness could spread, if not checked by religious observance and ritual. The Old Testament book of Leviticus lays down clear rules of purity around childbirth. Archaeological finds in Jerusalem demonstrate how severe purification laws of the period were in some parts of the Holy Land.
After all, Jerusalem was the city of God, and to be close to the house of God, you had to be as pure as possible.
As today in Judaism, a special bath was used for spiritual cleansing.
Every Jewish house of the first century had a mikveh, a ritual pool for purification practices. In terms of Mary who gives birth to Jesus, it would seem, based on the purity laws that existed at that time, that men would not have been allowed to be present. And while Mary is undergoing the purification rites within a ritual pool, men wouldn't have been able to access the room in which their birth had taken place, even to come into direct contact with the baby.
Other recently discovered evidence from the time of Jesus confirms how intensely these laws were observed and how they may have impacted on the nativity scene. The Dead Sea Scrolls are a unique collection of manuscripts discovered in the late 1940s in caves near the Dead Sea. Theologian James Charlesworth has investigated them using new technology that allows previously unreadable text to be deciphered. One fragment in particular attracted his attention.
In this scroll, we have a heightened purity law. It says that an impure woman, any house she goes into, the house is impure. So we can say during the time of Jesus, at that time in history, Jews put more emphasis upon being pure.
Luke, whom many believe to be a non-Jew, does make some reference to the purification laws. Matthew doesn't mention them at all. But careful study of their Gospels reveals one thing they do both agree on.
Most people think about Joseph being there when Jesus is being born, that he's with Mary during the time of her impurity, that is, giving birth. There is no New Testament text that says that Joseph was helping Mary give birth. There's no New Testament text that says he was there a day after the birth.
Neither Gospel mentions anyone other than Mary as present at the birth of Jesus. And from the biblical, historical, and archaeological evidence, we now know that for the first week at least, if anyone were there to attend mother and child, it would probably only have been women. Today, scholars think the reason the two gospel accounts vary so much from the likely reality of Jesus' birth is because neither Matthew nor Luke were associates of his.
Luke and Matthew probably wrote sometime in the 80s or 90s of the first century. We've actually no idea who Luke is.
Details of Matthew's life are equally hazy.
Most people nowadays don't think that he was an eyewitness of the events. I don't think it's necessary for Christians to believe every last detail of the Nativity story. I don't think you have to believe that all of those details are historical. And I think it's the theology of these stories that's important. And that's really what these ancient authors are trying to get across. What Matthew is doing here, I think, is writing for people who've become Christian from having been Jews earlier. And so they're thoroughly aware of the Old Testament texts. They're expecting some kind of a Christ. And so what Matthew is doing is assuring them that everything about Jesus was already foretold in the Old Testament.
And Luke has a very similar message. Jesus is the Christ. That's the word in Greek for Messiah. He is the Messiah for all those in the world. So Luke is much more universal. Matthew has one audience and Luke has another, but they have the same message. Luke is going to bring out the humility of Jesus. Matthew is going to bring out the kingship of Jesus.
The familiar nativity scene. A composite of the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Some Old Testament prophecy and centuries of supposition. But beneath it all lies the simple truth of the birth of Christ.
Behind that, maybe behind the shades of history, we can find the shadow of a man, the Galilean, that will come out of the hills of Nazareth and change our world.